The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. Members are reminded that per the guidance of the attending physician, member staff and all others physically present in any indoor space within the House of Representatives, including this hearing room, are required to wear masks except when recognized to address the committee. As a reminder, members, and we do have both members and witnesses participating remotely, thank you for doing that, should be visible on camera throughout the hearing as much as possible. As with in-person hearings, members and witnesses are responsible for controlling their own microphones. Those joining remotely should keep themselves muted, please, unless recognized by the chair, and should expeditiously unmute themselves when recognized. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff directly. Very grateful to all of our witnesses today, and a huge apology for what is going to be a little bit of a volatile hearing, in the sense that we are in the process of voting, and this is a fly-out date. So members will be coming in and out. They will be joining remotely, and we do apologize for that. It in no way, shape, or form reflects the really critical importance of this topic. And I'm happy to say one of the topics in which, with the passage of the infrastructure bill, we've actually been able to demonstrate not just a commitment to solving the problem, but doing it in a bipartisan way. So this is really a critical topic for us, and a critical topic because I think we all understand that disparity and lack of economic opportunity is as much about lack of connection and lack of connection to opportunity as it is about anything else. The hearing is entitled Connecting Americans to Prosperity: How Infrastructure Can Bolster Inclusive Economic Growth. Before we proceed to opening statements, I ask for unanimous consent that members who are not on the committee may be authorized to provide brief remarks when recognized by the chair. So ordered. I will also, before going into my opening statement, it has become the custom of the committee to allow members, Ms. Mace last time around, but members who know our witnesses, to do a brief introduction. And in the interest of timeliness, I will recognize the Congresswoman from Florida, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, for 1 minute to introduce one of our witnesses.
Thank you so much for your indulgence, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and my colleagues on this committee. It is my honor to introduce you to introduce your next panel witness, Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins. Commissioner Higgins represents a vibrant, diverse district from coastal cities like Miami and Miami Beach to the Brickell Financial Hub and the industrial areas around the Miami River, plus the proud Hispanic neighborhoods of Little Havana and West Flagler. She's a longtime and effective advocate for a living wage, sick leave, expanded healthcare coverage, and public transit. Ms. Higgins will provide this committee with firsthand knowledge of how the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law provided vital lifelines to our communities during this pandemic. But she can also explain how these transformative laws helped local leaders confront long-term systemic barriers to equitable economic prosperity, growth, and stability. These are critically important stories that we need to explore, and I'm thankful that there's a platform like this one in this committee to do so. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce this dynamic and respected leader in our community, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Florida and now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. During today's hearing, the Select Committee will examine the critical role that physical infrastructure plays in both being a conduit and, at times, a barrier to inclusive economic growth. The story of the last 2 centuries in this country is really remarkably telling. We have seen time and time again a remarkable mixture of public investment and private investment that has built out the infrastructure today, going back to George Washington helping build the C&O Canal at the country's birth, to the expansion of canals, to the subsidization of railroads in the mid and late 19th century. We developed sewage and water systems in the late 19th and 20th centuries with remarkable effects on the health of American citizens. We built and expanded ports, factories, airfields, and shipyards during World War II. We also built an awful lot of affordable housing immediately after World War II, which remains used today. Of course, the 1950s was an era in which we made highway construction and the expansion of the highway system, a national highway system, a national priority. And we helped fund the early basic research that led to one of our most important pieces of infrastructure, that is to say the internet, in the 1980s and 1990s. All of these infrastructure projects have been key to our national prosperity. That's not arguable. What is very, very interesting is the fact that each one of those things was, in many cases, a combination of public and private investment. It is also true that much of this investment was done, certainly in the 1950s and earlier, in a way that advantaged some Americans and disadvantaged others. Just south of my district, I get to Washington, D.C. by going across the Cross Bronx Expressway. It's convenient for me, but it absolutely devastated that neighborhood, which was a rich and vibrant neighborhood. That's what I see. There are obviously stories like this all over the country. So today we'll discuss how some past policies have negatively impacted certain communities and led to the marginalization and actually the decrease of opportunity associated with those infrastructure projects, and try to learn from those mistakes so that the investment we make in the future is more inclusive in terms of prosperity. And as is customary in this select committee, we'll identify practical solutions and best practices to build smart 21st century infrastructure to help every American reach their full economic potential. In the depths of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt designed a public works program, quote, to put more men back to work, both directly on the public works themselves and indirectly in the industries supplying the materials for these public works, because, quote, no country, however rich, can afford to waste of its human resources. Nearly 90 years later, amid a global pandemic, President Biden and on a bipartisan basis, the Congress of the United States has an opportunity to follow in FDR's footsteps with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. In doing so, we can contribute meaningfully to the future prosperity of every American, and I do mean every American. With that, I will conclude my statement and recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes of opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing. I look forward to a robust conversation. I think it really is important that we're making investments in our nation's infrastructure that can meaningfully improve people's lives. Strong infrastructure can provide individuals a safe road to drive on. It can help lower gas prices. It can make it affordable for people to heat their homes on a cold winter day. I think we're going to hear a lot about the infrastructure bill that was passed. And so let me share one of my biggest challenges that I see with the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. It wasn't paid for as promised. And so what does that mean? The $1.2 trillion bill is funded with $256 billion in debt. Right now, our national debt sits at $30 trillion. And so for a family of four, that breaks down to $360,000 for a family of four. That's their share of the national debt. Another issue with the bill is its implementation is being dictated often by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and not by local officials. And Mr. Chairman, I think this will actually fit into a lot of our conversation. Who's best to make these decisions? Is it local officials, and we have some local officials here with us today, or is it bureaucrats sitting in Washington, D.C.? For example, Biden's Department of Transportation wants to fund projects that often are following an ideological agenda. Highway investments that don't meet certain democratic guidelines and vague standards may not be prioritized for new grant money under the new Federal Highway Administration guidelines, some of which were recently released. This leaves potential projects vulnerable to political motivation, underfunding if they don't meet the social demands of the Department of Transportation. Under these same conditions, it also means plans to expand existing roads and bridges that reduce traffic congestion can get sidelines. We need to make sure the money gets to the local governments that need it. We don't need more bureaucrats in Washington picking winners and losers. Another challenge with the bill is the wasteful spending unrelated to infrastructure. For example, the bill invests $7.5 billion in electric vehicle charging stations across the country. And I suspect we'll have a robust conversation today about the definition of infrastructure. And you may believe that electric vehicles are the future. You may disagree with that. But to me, that's not the issue here. What's at issue is whether the federal government or the private sector should determine where electric charging stations should be. As gas stations were being built across the United States in the 1900s, were those being built by the federal government or the private sector? If a private individual builds a gas station and it's successful, good for her. And if it loses money, it's unfortunate. But either way, taxpayers aren't on the hook. This bill, in many ways, is replacing the role of the private sector with the federal government. Over the past year, we saw the current administration continually discourage private sector investment in infrastructure. For example, on day one of the Biden administration, he canceled the Keystone pipeline, killing thousands of jobs in the private sector with a stroke of a pen. A year later, costs have risen 30%. That's often $173 per household. In cold states like Wisconsin, prices are up 45%. Home heating costs uniquely hurt low-income workers and people living on fixed incomes. I think that's really important. High heating costs to heat your homes is uniquely impacting low-income workers and seniors living on fixed incomes. Without enough domestic energy production, we're often importing energy from overseas. And so, for example, in November of last year, November of 2021, we paid almost $1.5 billion for Russian gas to fuel our economy. But Mr. Chairman, here's where I think we can be productive, because I always try to do this in my opening statement, not just where I disagree, but where we can be productive. I think one of the keys here is how do we figure out a way to make cost-effective investments in our infrastructure? So, for example, New York City recently built a subway tunnel of 3.5 miles at a cost of $12 billion. It's $3.5 billion per mile, which when you start to look at the national averages, and the New York Times had a great article on this, it was 7 times the cost of the global average. There's a similar story in Massachusetts. In 2005, the plan to connect Boston to its suburbs with a light rail ballooned from $500 million to a $3 billion blunder. We spend more money per mile on rail transit than almost any country in the world. I think it's a massive opportunity that we can look for improvement. I think we should reevaluate the environmental review process and labor regulations to complete infrastructure projects far more efficiently. And we can do this without lowering our environmental standards. Reducing costs and regulatory burdens will improve infrastructure projects now and into the future. And I'll say it again, America needs infrastructure that keeps the cost of gas low, provides safe roads, and heats our homes. Instead, we're often seeing the results of overspending and inflation. I think infrastructure can meaningfully improve Americans' daily lives, and I hope we find ways to do that in our discussion today. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
I thank you, the ranking member. And before we turn to our witnesses, it's the custom of the committee, so that we don't lose sight of the people we are here to serve, to start every hearing with 4 minutes and 4 minutes only of video that allows everyday Americans to sort of tell the relevant story. So with unanimous consent, we will play the video and then turn to our witnesses.
I have had the pleasure of having served as a county commissioner for 22 years up to now. The 4-county area has one of the highest poverty rates in the state of Texas. That kind of, in a nutshell, tells you about the 1.4 million people that live in the 4-county area of South Texas, which is the largest urbanized area in the U.S. that is not served by an interstate highway system. The economy of the region that we're in involves international trade. A lot of Mexico trade comes through us, agribusiness, food processing, port industries, energy development, medical services, and tourism, and now to some extent, space activities. We've seen the growth that interstate system has provided for the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and it is phenomenal. We think that for the most impoverished areas of the state of Texas, that an investment by the federal government would have equally good effects on our economy, transportation infrastructure to help develop less disparity in communities that are underserved is probably the best investment that this nation could have. The enduring and lasting effect is that it provides more opportunities to the folks that live in the area to be able to achieve their dreams, live their lives, and have a decent living and becoming a middle-class American.
Transportation is a big issue. I think from an employers need to be involved in that too, because you got them, you're kind of clustered. When you got a corridor like that, if the employers can go together and government might concede that a little bit, along with the employer, you've got nonprofits that provide transportation. We actually went to some of the churches, because if you think about the churches, they have vans that they use on Sundays and for other events, but they sat during the week and asked them if they would be willing, and they were, to kind of run in our pilot program to work with the employers, because you got to have a partnership between all this. But here you got the non-partner, it's partnering with the business community to help address the need. You need employees. The employees are here. We've got the employees who you've hired or willing to hire, and we need to get them from here, from point A to point B. So what do we do? Here's a role for nonprofits to be involved in that. And that doesn't mean that, sometimes the bus systems within the cities are kind of quirky, in Milwaukee, where they run to the city line and then they stop right at the count, where the city line stops, but Florida is still like 4 or 5 blocks away from there. So it doesn't always work from the municipal transportation pieces. So we've got to be more creative in how we think about solutions to address that.
I live in Welch. We are a very rural area. I do kind of feel rural Minnesota's been left behind. With dial-up internet, it is difficult to keep up. We've made a choice to do everything via Zoom, and not having good internet can cause lots of problems with Zoom meetings. Having to use my Wi-Fi for the VPN cuts out. It's nice to come into work and be able to have high-speed internet. Some of the things I've had to save and do while I've been in the office. I've now become accustomed to doing medical appointments with the healthcare providers via electronic delivery. So that's been a huge change for me. Doing that from home can be difficult when there's lags and delays. Broadband access keeps us connected to each other. It connects us to our lives. I'm hoping with the bipartisan infrastructure law, we will have faster internet so that every part of our lives that we need the internet for will improve. We need to get this done because, it's the way of life now. We have to have it.
Okay, we turn now to our witnesses, and by way of brief introduction, first we have Dr. Carlos Martin, David Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution and Director of the Remodeling Futures Program at Harvard University. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies, Director of the Center for Technology Innovation and Co-Editor-in-Chief of the Tech Tank podcast at the Brookings Institution. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Rick Wade, Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Outreach at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Then we will hear from the Honorable, as Debbie Wasserman Schultz told us, Ms. Eileen Higgins, County Commissioner for Miami-Dade County. And lastly, we will hear from Mr. Neil Crabtree, who is a foreman and pipeline welder. Witnesses are reminded that their oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see a timer directly in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left. For those joining remotely, the timer will appear as a participant on your screen. When you have 1 minute remaining, a yellow light will appear. I ask that you be mindful of the timer. When the red light appears, quickly wrap up your testimony so we can respect the time of the other witnesses and the committee members. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Dr. Martin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for an oral presentation of your testimony.
Good morning. Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and members of the Select Committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss infrastructure in relation to your charge. The greatness of our nation's physical infrastructure is matched by its massive economic contributions. Infrastructure creates jobs, builds businesses, and fosters trade while being a vehicle from which other economic activity flourishes, in addition to providing basic human services. Yet infrastructure's achievements mask past disparities. Simply put, not everyone has benefited from infrastructure's economic promise. I congratulate the committee for exploring this oversight, and I offer 5 points for your consideration. First, the evidence of economic disparities from past infrastructure is overwhelming. Projects have frequently been designed without the fair participation of all stakeholders and have resulted in economic disparities in the places in which they are built. Indeed, stories of displaced families, blighted local businesses, pollutant-exposed households, and exclusion from transport, clean water, and other services have been a shameful part of infrastructure's history. I encourage this committee to support further research that synthesizes the qualities of disparity from individual projects and quantifies their cumulative economic effects. This evidence can be used to define fair distributions in future investments. Second, there are many infrastructure systems, and each has its own historical cases of unfair practices. The American Society of Civil Engineers, of which I am a member, sorts our infrastructures into 18 categories. There are more, such as the managed ecosystems that serve as hazard barriers and that support local and indigenous economies, the climate adaptation, cybersecurity infrastructure that has yet to be invented, and the largest segments of our built environment, housing. I encourage this committee to consider the full range of physical infrastructure as each sector produces distinct economic outcomes and manifests inequity differently. Third, there are many ways in which infrastructure disparities take form. My work has benefited from considering 6 fundamental dimensions of equity, each of which can inform policy. For example, understanding the geography of past unfair infrastructure allows us to prioritize those same harmed communities for new resources. Requiring authentic community engagement ensures that possibly unfair effects are mitigated, and it encourages buy-in. Monitoring hiring and contracting, including job transitions, fairly distributes immediate economic benefits, while assessing long-term impacts on health and possessions can avoid economic burdens to low-income households and the legal costs to stakeholders. I encourage the committee to explore how these dimensions are addressed in current federal statute and program rules. Consistent definitions of equity will not only help underserved communities, but also reduce inefficient regulatory burdens. Fourth, there are examples of infrastructure's attempts at fairness from which we can draw lessons. Common elements of the projects I described in my written testimony include the intentional identification of underserved communities within a project scope, the extensive community participation, and collaboration between public works and other silos that yield co-benefits. And by that I mean added value to community health, cultural cohesion, and direct financial revenue in addition to a project's physical objectives. The projects also show that fair practices and analysis need not be a radical departure from contemporary infrastructure professional practice. These positive projects faced many challenges, from braiding funds and negotiating conflicts in statutes and program rules that this committee should review. Congress could also incent research and pilots to produce innovations that marry equity analysis with cutting-edge engineering. This will yield more examples of fair infrastructure, demonstrating that equitable infrastructure can produce fair economies and greater gains than infrastructure that is less measured. Fifth, low-income communities also need technical resources. Communities, especially rural ones, need knowledge in addition to money. I urge the committee to consider resourcing consistent and high-quality infrastructure technical assistance for underserved communities. Congress could also encourage regional infrastructure planning that integrates urban and rural infrastructure better and brings regional economies together. I close by reflecting on recent debates regarding infrastructure policy, such as claims that recently passed Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act inscribes a, quote, social agenda, unquote, within the wires, concrete, and pipes of our infrastructure. But infrastructure that is not equitable is, by default, inequitable. The negative cases I note in my testimony demonstrate a clear pattern. Our government at all levels and our private sector providers must ensure that the rules for building and maintaining our infrastructure are fair for everyone. Federal guidance is needed to set that fair playing field for future growth now, not to keep up pretense that it was fair in the past. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Dr. Turner Lee, who I believe is coming to us remotely, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stile, and distinguished members of the Select Committee. As it's been mentioned, my work at Brookings encompasses regulatory and legislative policy that is focused on expanding broadband infrastructure and closing the digital divide. I'd like to, in my testimony today, really pay attention to this historic time where our nation's degrading infrastructure has an additive component of broadband, which has been appropriated $65 billion of the $1.2 trillion of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. On this topic, I just plan to share in my oral testimony with the committee why broadband infrastructure must be equitably deployed in both rural and urban areas, and why closing the digital divide must be prioritized to promote an inclusive digital ecosystem. My oral testimony will conclude with 3 actionable proposals going forward, such as remaining technology neutral and solutions that address rural and urban divides, ensuring that infrastructure of broadband complements and modernizes other national and local infrastructure assets, and positioning digital equity as a fundamental component of the decision-making around where and to whom broadband infrastructure is deployed. Since 2005, the FCC has defined broadband as 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits up as the minimum standard of service, an area that has recently been challenged by lawmakers and other policy advocates who want to see that definition changed to at least symmetrical speeds of 100 up. And we are clear that during the pandemic, rural and urban areas alike needed higher and better broadband to access and promote outcomes in public safety, reliability, and economic growth. Prior to the pandemic, 46% of our small businesses had an online presence, resulting in permanent closures due to their inability to shift to online resources and tools. Similarly, more advanced broadband networks like 5G and satellite have been improving user experiences and enabling more entrepreneurial and enterprising functions like autonomous vehicles, smart home devices, virtual reality systems, and more. But that is when broadband is available. And our public sector has even relied upon broadband as an infrastructure when it comes to everything from scheduling vaccination appointments and distributing test kits. But my second point is this: we still have a digital divide. Despite the use of broadband technology, we still see in rural areas 17.6 million residents who lack terrestrial fixed access. And I met many of those people as part of a book project that I'm doing, and their stories are noted in my longer written testimony. Concurrently, the number of disconnected households in urban areas is 3 times that of rural areas. Low-income communities of color, who also consist of the elderly and the disabled, are particularly impacted. And we're finding an income gap, which I would suggest for all of the members of Congress that we are seeing that the digital divide is not so much about bits and bytes and hardware and service, but is symptomatic of poverty, geographic, and social isolation. But I would say this, as we think about the Infrastructure Act, that we have to go beyond traditional supply and demand arguments and view the digital divide as one of those areas where we need solutions. We do not have competing interests between rural and urban. We have competing infrastructure needs and investments of citizens. Every community in both rural and urban areas had a K-12 school that shut down. Every community had the need for telehealth. And in rural areas in particular, we found that the most poor and the most isolated were not able to participate. And every community had a need to move people to remote work, particularly those jobs that were agile enough. And we know that we want to have those opportunities more available, particularly in our workforce who will be building this new broadband infrastructure. I want to close my testimony today with 3 salient takeaways that the country should address so that our forthcoming investments in broadband infrastructure are not done in haste and waste. We must maintain technology neutrality and, as it's been mentioned, focus on regional development to generate more tailored solutions for rural and urban areas. We are now looking at fiber optics, but there are a range of solutions that we should be tapping into that may allow us to leverage public-private partnerships and facilitate better continuous allocations between our rural and urban areas. It can also generate jobs if we look at regional development approaches more carefully. Broadband must be complementary to other national local infrastructure. And in fact, we should incentivize that. As it's been mentioned, not only are we looking at ways to make more efficient public transportation systems and energy systems, 1.2 million units of public housing, some of them do not have broadband access, and we should make that infrastructure modernized and smart. And finally, we must position equity in our plans as we prioritize broadband, particularly among the states. States must be required to deliver a digital equity plan so that we ensure that the least are served first and those that are served last are those that we know we need to serve as part of our competitiveness. Thank you, and I apologize for that second over.
Thank you, Dr. Turner Lee. Mr. Wade, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Style, and distinguished members of the Select Committee, let me say first, thank you for this opportunity to testify. I am Rick Wade, Senior Vice President of Strategic Alliances and Outreach at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. As many of you know, for more than 2 decades, the Chamber has been at the forefront of advocacy for investment in the modernization of America's aging infrastructure. We're grateful to Congress for passage of the historic bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act signed into law by President Biden. I grew up poor in a rural textile town in South Carolina, and actually remember the days when the school bus had to travel down dirt roads to pick up students. As a young boy, I vividly recall how excited I was when indoor plumbing was installed in our home. Times have changed and we made progress, but most people live in homes with functional plumbing and clean water today. Most of our roads and bridges and roads are now paved, allowing us to safely get to schools and jobs, grocery stores, banks, and hospitals. But for many communities, whether minority, Appalachian, tribal, urban, or rural, the dream of an inclusive economic infrastructure is still not yet a reality. Existing disparities in public infrastructure continue to have profound costs on communities of color. Decisions on highway placement in decades past continue to separate minority neighborhoods from commercial districts. Today, fewer transit options and longer commutes from minority neighborhoods to job centers can make it more difficult to maintain employment and balance family obligations. Black, Latino, and Native Americans are more likely to live in homes without clean drinking water, impacting both health and the cost of living. Households of color are also more likely to live near toxic Superfund sites in need of cleanup, impacting health, property values, and local economic opportunities. Inclusive infrastructure investments can transform these communities that have been historically underserved and improve the quality of life for all people. As local, state, and federal officials decide which highway and transit projects should be funded, it is critical that they prioritize transit projects that indeed shorten the long multi-stop commutes between minority communities and job centers, that fix highways that bifurcate neighborhoods, and improve road quality and capacity to improve economic opportunity. The act includes $55 billion to ensure that households, schools, daycare centers, and businesses have access to clean water. Critically, $15 billion is set aside specifically to replace lead water pipes, which literally bring poison through the tap. Lead water pipes happen to be the most prominent in older, low-income minority neighborhoods. Few things are as important to education, job creation, and economic opportunity than access to high-speed broadband internet. Through $42 billion for broadband equity access and deployment, we can close internet access gaps that, if unaddressed, will hold back minority communities in the years to come. Finally, we hope that America's 8 million minority-owned businesses will finally have a seat at the table and help build out our modern infrastructures, prime and subprime contractors, planners, designers, architects, engineers, and the like. The Chamber has long advocated for the codification and increased support for the Minority Business Development Agency. And we're grateful that provisions regarding MBDA were included in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. Streamlining procurement processes, simplifying government lending programs, and unbundling large contracts will help these enterprises be even more competitive and create jobs in the communities where they exist. We at the Chamber, we're going to work with major corporations to develop innovative partnerships and expand their diverse suppliers and enhance access to needed credit, capital, and bonding. Through the Chamber's Equality of Opportunity Initiative, we will continue to advance private and public sector solutions to help close opportunity gaps in America. It's not only a moral imperative, but a matter of our economic competitiveness. We look forward to working with you in these efforts as we move forward in the days and months and years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wade. Ms. Higgins, you're now recognized for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your testimony.
Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stiles, and distinguished members of the committee, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm Miami-Dade County Commissioner Eileen Higgins. When I say thank you, I'm not only speaking for myself, but for countless commissioners across America. With the approval of the bipartisan infrastructure law, your message was pretty clear. America's infrastructure needs investment, both to repair what we have and to build what we need. And as local governments, we agree. Each county is going to have its own needs: broadband, aging bridges, building roads. My residents would say they need affordable housing near public transit so they can get more quickly towards economic opportunity. And that is because transit infrastructure is housing infrastructure. Affordable housing is even more affordable when it's located near reliable transit. But transit projects, well, they are expensive, and counties can't fund them alone. That's why it's exciting to see that transit is a key component in the bill. Transit investments increase access to opportunity, and there's no place better to showcase this than South Florida. Miami-Dade has immense disparities. Some people live extremely well, but others struggle to make ends meet in an economy dependent on tourism jobs. It's also huge. It's bigger than 2 states. Commutes can be arduous for low-income residents who often don't live anywhere near economic hubs. Like Florida City, poverty, it's 40%, and they are 40 miles away from most jobs. Residents can spend up to an hour and a half commuting each way to jobs downtown. With FTA funding for our South Corridor, commute times will now be cut in half. But that investment, however, is building more than just transit. It is also catalyzing economic development and private sector investment. Visit, and you'll see thousands of affordable housing units, mid-rise apartment buildings, and commercial centers under construction, all because a $100 million federal investment is spurring billions in local housing investments and creating jobs in parts of the county where opportunity has long lagged. These new funds are meant to jumpstart our infrastructure transformation, and as counties, we're ready to get started. But I think we all know that permitting and NEPA can sometimes add months to project approvals. That's why we are thrilled that the infrastructure bill recognizes that federal approvals need streamlining. Public transportation projects, by their nature, are environmental projects and should be evaluated as such. Let me be clear, environmental reviews are important. We welcome them. In South Florida, the environment is our economy, so the stakes are high. We just would like you to do it faster. You've got a tough job ahead prioritizing which projects to fund first. I urge you to start with those that will make a difference for struggling families, especially in places that have a legacy of inequity. Communities of color still lack equal access to jobs close to their homes, economic investments in their neighborhoods, and reliable public transportation. In Miami-Dade, building a North Corridor matters because it would connect Florida's largest African-American municipality to our existing rail system, making it easier for residents to compete for jobs outside of their neighborhoods. That's what inclusive growth looks like. It also means building infrastructure in rural communities so they too have access to opportunity. Federal agencies must be prepared to provide technical assistance to small counties as they seek project funds. As counties, we are responsible for building much of the nation's infrastructure. We are your boots on the ground, but we can't do it alone. We need and we value your partnership. Today leaves me with great hope that these federal investments will build the critical infrastructure America needs to remain competitive, and that infrastructure, the infrastructure that we build, will connect more people with opportunities to achieve the American dream. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Higgins. Mr. Crabtree, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Himes, Ranking Member Stahl, and all committee members. Appreciate you letting me speak with you here today. As someone who spent the last 25 years in energy infrastructure, I've seen and I've been a working part of a great achievement for America. For decades, this country relied on foreign governments for a lot of our energy needs, and we often have felt the negative effects when groups like OPEC decided to tighten supplies. Now, realizing the importance of energy independence, hundreds of thousands of men and women chose careers in this field, and for the first time, America achieved that goal, and we have since been rewarded with lower energy prices for all. But over the past year, the pain of higher energy prices have come back. The only difference this time, it's a self-inflicted pain. Now, I realize that most of today's hearing will focus on roads and bridges, and rightfully so. It's the one thing that everyone can agree upon when it comes to infrastructure. But just like roads and bridges, our nation's pipeline system is aging too. And just like the roads and bridges, it needs attention. It needs maintained, it needs strengthened. In a lot of cases, capacity needs to be added. Now, the great thing about my industry is we don't usually rely on government funding. Most of our projects are privately funded. And to me, that's the real definition of job creation. The government does, however, play a major role in the permitting process. And it's this process that concerns me and millions of other people affected in this industry. It seems over the past few years that the permitting process is being used more as a weapon to stop much-needed projects instead of moving them forward. And one example that comes to my mind is the Mountain Valley Pipeline. This is a 300-mile project that would have brought much-needed natural gas to the East Coast. And this project has been in the planning stages, in the construction stages for nearly 8 years, and it's still in court right now over permits after 8 years. No project should still be in the courtroom battles after 8 years. You know, instead of voicing all their opinions against these pipelines in the planning stages, they seem to be dragging them out one at a time, and a lot of the times it's proved to be an effective tactic. When you spend 8 years in a courtroom, it gets too costly to move these projects forward. And many of the roads and bridges in this infrastructure bill, they're going to face the same opposition, but only this time, instead of private money being wasted, it'll be taxpayer dollars wasted. It amounts to our national debt, as if $30 trillion isn't enough. As I said earlier, roads and bridges are often the selling point when it comes to infrastructure, but a Build Back Better plan shouldn't mean the total neglect and destruction of our energy sector as we know it. There are some political leaders that refer to fossil fuels as a dying industry, but that's just not the case. Two things that happened last year that can prove my point. When the Colonial Pipeline was hacked, it had infected the entire East Coast, and $5 million in ransom was paid to get it back online. And why? Because we depend on that pipeline. And the second thing, to combat rising fuel prices, President Biden, he authorized the release of 50 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. You know, this after canceling my job on the Keystone Pipeline. The one thing the president did not do was access the Green Energy Reserve because it does not exist right now. This country is entering a dangerous territory if we keep neglecting our reliable forms of energy and setting deadlines for a green energy plan to take over that is nowhere near capable or ready to produce the amount of energy it takes to run this country. In my career, in my industry, we're not dying, but we are, however, under attack. And this attack is costing good-paying career jobs. It's costing unnecessary high-energy prices being felt by all. And we have set ourselves up for record-breaking fuel prices this summer, and someone is going to have to answer for it. We may not be able to afford to drive our vehicles to the polling stations this November. Our bank accounts may be empty, but we're coming to vote in November to fix this problem. And I look forward to any questions you might have, and thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crabtree. Before we proceed to questions, I ask unanimous consent to submit the following statement on successful programs diversifying the infrastructure workforce from Elizabeth Skidmore with North Atlantic States Regional Council of Carpenters into the hearing record. So ordered. Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Dr. Martin, let me start with you. And by the way, because we have relatively small number of members, we may be able to do a second round. Nonetheless, I'm going to ask, I've got 3 questions and would just ask for quick answers. Dr. Martin, you said something that stuck with me. At the end of your testimony, you said, find better ways to integrate rural and urban infrastructure. Very intriguing. Can you give me a minute of elaboration on what exactly that means and maybe an example of where it's being done?
Certainly, Chairman Himes. And the video that we saw at the beginning describing Milwaukee Transit ending at the county line is a great example of this. The benefits of integrating rural and urban economies are inherently integrated. There is no doubt about that. The question is, how well does infrastructure support that integration? And certainly, from water delivery systems through transit being the most obvious, there are many opportunities to do a better job of that kind of integration. And that also involves being very innovative about the kinds of transit systems that we want. So not just simply surface transportation, but also rail and a variety of other options that we have that can better integrate and allow people to reduce the transit time and costs. So I can think of a gazillion examples on the transit side. Certainly the extensions of roads that we're mentioning in Miami-Dade County is one example. The investments in not just in the surface road that came out of the Infrastructure Act, but also the public transit that better ensures that that access is allowable for rural communities to partake of and participate in. Now, just the other note, and that's not only employment, but also trade, because obviously things from rural communities have to come to urban communities like food. So these are important transit routes.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Dr. Turner Lee, I have a question for you. One of the things I will never forget of the COVID experience is, at least in my district, which is pretty densely populated, getting the wire or the service to a lower income or an unwired family in some ways was the easy part. Again, it's a fairly densely packed district. And I'm confident that with the investment we're making, the subsidies and the money we're putting into making sure that all Americans have access to broadband, but that will happen. But the thing that sticks with me is that that's really in some ways the least part of the challenge. So I have an immigrant-heavy community. Many times you have parents who are not terribly fluent in English. You have young children who I find it hard enough to, hook up my own modems and that sort of thing. So it sort of felt to me like getting the wire to the household was the easy part. It's the maintenance, it's the IT function. My question to you is, if you agree with me, what are examples of programs or municipalities or companies that are doing a good job at addressing that other piece of making sure people have access to broadband?
You know what, Chairman, it's very hard because I think all of us have had Post-it notes up and we've not really come up with a really good repository of what's actually worked. To your point, I think what we're actually finding in communities that are very culturally different and racially different is the examples that what you're talking about. We've relied upon anchor institutions, faith-based institutions that have helped families navigate the digital divide. We've actually seen community-based organizations that have essentially helped with language proficiencies. The challenge that we have is these level of digital navigators are nowhere in this bill, and they're not necessarily someplace in Corporation for National Service, which I've actually advocated for. What I'd like to see, just to close up based on what you said, is I think we need a comprehensive approach to digital literacy. Right now, the infrastructure bill, we about $2 billion. Perhaps we need to think about leveraging other assets in the Corporation for National Service or in education, where we could actually train people to be local ambassadors in their community. Because as you said, relevance is still a concern among communities, and particularly among the Latino community, there's a fear of transparency or putting out enough information. And I have several examples of that across the country as well. So we got to do a better job when it comes to digital literacy and not focus just on supply.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Turner Lee. This is something I'm going to want to follow up on because I, in my position of ignorance here, I'm not in a place to make obvious or recommendations, but things like AmeriCorps, community-based organizations, as you said, faith institutions. I wonder if there's not a way to get them more active on this issue because, again, we can put the wire in and the modem into the home, but when it goes wrong, that person may as well not have the wire and the modem. I am almost out of time, but I do suspect we'll have an opportunity for a second round, but I do want to get the other members an opportunity to ask questions. But my next question, it was really, I was struck, Ms. Higgins and Mr. Crabtree, you both made the point that we need to do a better job at streamlining the approval process. And, these approval processes exist for a reason in that everybody gets to sort of speak up around environmental concerns. We don't want our infrastructure destroying communities. They exist for a reason, but there's no reason why they shouldn't be more efficient and more rapid. And so when I come back around on my second round, I'm going to ask you both to offer up examples and suggestions for how we can do that. With that, I will yield back and recognize the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I totally agree. I think there really is some unique opportunities where we can streamline the approval process and at the same time not actually degrade our key environmental provisions. Mr. Crabtree, appreciate you being here and sharing your story. Want to dive in a little bit to get some additional understanding of the process here. Do pipelines such as the Keystone pipeline receive federal funding?
No, that's mostly a privately funded operation.
So private sector investment?
Yes, sir.
And so they're not risking taxpayer funds?
In fact, it's just the opposite. Most of these pipelines, once they're in service, provide tax revenue for states and locals.
Okay, and do your colleagues have specialized training and skills?
Excuse me, Congressman?
The training and skill needed to be able to do your job. You're a welder, you're a foreman. I know you had a couple hundred people under you at one point. What kind of specialized training and skills would you have?
It's mostly on-the-job training. Like I said, I've been doing this for 25 years, and it's, you know, to make the amount of money that we're making, it ain't something that you're offered right up front. It's many years of training.
So a young man or woman coming out of high school works for a couple of years. What kind of salary range or hourly pay might they be able to obtain?
Well, entry-level positions in this field, you know, $50,000 to $70,000 is not unheard of. It all depends on how often you want to work. It's like any field. The more effort you put into it, the more you're
So say you're now, say that individual goes through, they become a journeyman, say they're 5 to 10 years in. What might a salary range look like for that type of man or woman?
Well, then, at that point, you're looking at, you know, a career paying jobs, you know, well over $100,000 a year.
So $100,000 per year, you're coming out with a high school background, you're learning on-the-job training skills, private sector infrastructure investment, and then we saw on day one of the Biden administration, by the stroke of a pen, killed thousands of jobs, including your own?
Yes, sir. That's one of the very first things that happened on the inauguration. You know, I was laid off at 3 o'clock that afternoon.
You were laid off on the inauguration day at 3 p.m.?
Yes, sir. It was one of the very first agendas the president had. That's why I took it so personally. You know, we're facing a lot of problems in this country. I don't think laying me off on day one was the smartest move to make.
So you're a foreman, and how many men and women were working under you or with you at that time?
At the time on the project, it was in the early stages, maybe 100, but, you know, throughout the spring and the summer is when we would have been adding those 12,000.
But let's call it a rough math, 100 or so individuals are working with you at that time.
At that time.
Were they all laid off at the same time?
Everybody.
So on day one of the Biden administration, 3 p.m., following his decision to kill the Keystone pipeline, 100 individuals, including yourself, lost their jobs.
That was just on my specific part of the project.
Just in your specific
Nebraska,
part, right?
yes.
Thousands of jobs total, but in your personal experience, you saw jobs that were paying absolute living wages, entry level 50 to 70,000. As you gained experience, you might be in your late 20s, early 30s at this point. You could be earning north of $100,000 a year, building infrastructure, private sector, no taxpayer dollars at risk. The permits had been previously issued, stroke of a pen. Those jobs are gone.
Those jobs are gone, building a pipeline, bringing the same oil that's still coming into the country this day.
And would you encourage other folks to take the career path that you've chosen?
I'm going to. I can't give up on it. I don't want this country to end up in the same situation as, say, Germany, where we're having to buy fuel from Russia, of all places. So I'm going to encourage people to stay in this industry because we need fossil fuels, whether people like it or not.
And have you seen that demand for oil and natural gas increase or decrease over the course of last year?
Well, I think everyone can tell from the prices at the pump. You know, it's a supply and demand issue. It's increasing. It's not going down.
I agree with you, and I think one of the challenges that we see it in Wisconsin. Wisconsin gets really cold in the winter, and home heating costs are going up. The average home heating cost is up well north of $100 for every household. And in a state like Wisconsin, where the heating costs have gone up dramatically, and it's been pretty cold, which is actually pretty normal in Wisconsin in January and February, it's clobbering families in the pocketbooks, in particular low-income earners and seniors on fixed incomes. People who are high-income earners can navigate through these fluctuations in their utility bills, but man, I can't tell you how many low-income workers, seniors on fixed incomes come up and talk to me, either at the pump or in the grocery store when I'm home in Janesville or I'm over in Kenosha or Racine, Wisconsin. It's time and again, and so I think it's just really critical that we look at our private sector infrastructure investment, in particular as it relates to energy, and the impact that this has in some of our large urban areas on the East Coast, but it also has it across the board, across the United States. It's really hitting people in their pocketbooks right now, and I think there's an opportunity to change course, in particular on private sector infrastructure investment. Cognizant of the time, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
I thank the ranking member, and let me see, is Ms. Capter with us remotely? It seems not. In that case, Ms. Jayapal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Robust public infrastructure is a prerequisite for prosperity, but it's more than an obligation. It's actually an opportunity to make lasting and transformational change to our economy and shift it from an extractive one to a resilient one. an inequitable one to one that benefits everyone, white, black, and brown. And I'm so proud, Mr. Chairman, that under this president and a Democratic Congress, we have created 6.4 million new jobs in just the first year of the Biden administration. We have brought unemployment down to 3.9%, and that is a full 2 years before economists thought we would get down to that level. And of course, we have made a good start to rebuilding our country by passing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, but we got to do more. We got to do more to figure out how to engage smaller communities and businesses and local governments, as well as communities of color that are left out of the planning and therefore then left out of the process of competing for bigger grants that bigger localities and firms can get. So I wanted to focus on this disparity. A recent study found that in communities affected by natural disasters, Black Americans lost nearly $20,000 in wealth, where their white counterparts gained over $126,000 in wealth from investments in rebuilding those communities. So, Mr. Wade, in your opinion, what is behind these disparities, and how can the federal government ensure that communities of color are actually included in the process of infrastructure planning and implementation?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the reality, there's a number of things. I kind of refer to the social determinants of wealth, the way we look at the social determinants of health. It's inclusive of everything from education gaps to gaps that in opportunities for Black and minority-owned businesses. It is infrastructure, which is why we're here today in reality to talk about how infrastructure and closing the infrastructure gaps and connecting these communities to job centers and commerce and trade is so important in closing the wealth gaps. And I think so all of that collectively, I think contribute to the challenges that we're experiencing today, but also present a unique opportunity. And infrastructure is just absolutely critical, a critical part of that process.
Thank you. I recently introduced a bill called the Climate Resilience Workforce Bill, and it actually recognizes that the people that do the work after climate disasters are actually largely folks of color, and if we can rebuild that workforce, and if we can make sure that we're putting an emphasis on including minority firms and communities in the planning, we're going to be much more effective. Mr. Martin, your research exposes the long history of excluding communities of color in infrastructure and housing investments and how it perpetuates inequality. How can the federal government avoid repeating those same mistakes?
Thank you, Congresswoman. And certainly there are many opportunities to think through in every funding structure that the federal government invests in and within state and local governments. And my written testimony, I talk about 6 different dimensions of equity and how the federal government can use policy to inform those. One is simply starting to identify those places that have suffered in the past as targeted places for investment. We've done this many bipartisan ways of identifying low-income communities that deserve additional resources to repair past injustices. So that's number one. Second is authentic community engagement, including involving local civic community groups that are often asked to attend community hearings with no pay, no compensation, no opportunity to really bring in their members, including poor, low-income community members who don't have the resources and the bandwidth to attend 5 community hearings in the evenings when they have to take care of their kids or holding down the 3rd job. And there are a variety of other ways in which this happens, including making sure that the training programs that are offered for infrastructure, the hiring, my colleague from the chamber who mentioned contracting processes are all very inclusive and very well thought out. And that includes job transitions for local community members. In fact, just this very morning, I got a notice from the American Society of Civil Engineers, which I'm a member, that sends out their daily notices saying that there's a job training program in New Jersey training young adults from low-income communities on water infrastructure, preparing for the massive jobs that they're hoping to see come out. And those are the kinds of things that we have to think about, very thoughtful ways in which state and local governments can ensure that federal monies are equitable.
That's so important. And if we, when we pass the pieces of that we have in the Build Back Better Act, that will give us the opportunity to train workforces, to prepare for climate resilience, and to make sure we are building up the infrastructure of every part of our country, including the childcare infrastructure, the service infrastructure, and creating those good jobs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, real quick.
The gentleman's time has expired. I will happily allow Mr. Arrington to yield time to Mr. Donald. With that, I recognize Mr. Arrington for 5 minutes.
Look, can't find my notes. But I will tell you that the infrastructure for our country and the investment that we make collectively as a Congress is important to our economic growth, our economic security. All boats rise on the tide of American prosperity. And there are dilapidated components, crumbling infrastructure, as both parties have said. Here's my exception to this. We are 30 trillion in debt, and our deficit spending is crowding out private capital. It's driving up interest rates, along with other things like monetary policy, easy money. So we're in one breath talking about growth and job creation, and in another, we're setting ourselves back. Not only that, but with inflation, it's the most regressive tax that you can put on working Americans. So now you talk about infrastructure. We ought to target the core infrastructure, waterways, ports, roads and bridges. But you have tens of billions of dollars in subsidies for clean energy and with low carbon output ferries and buses. And I'm not saying that we can't have a good, honest debate on the issue of climate, but this is not the time to throw that kind of money. We've spent $500 billion more than we normally spend on infrastructure after trillions of dollars to help our country get through this unprecedented disaster of COVID. And we were all in on that. And now we want to spend $500 billion more. Now, my colleague said it was paid for. Maybe they don't stand by that today. CBO said $250 billion is not paid for. $250 billion. Do you know what the pay-fors are? Gimmicks. Both sides use these ridiculous, shameful, fraudulent gimmicks. Like, for example, $50 billion of that pay-for was a rebate rule, drug price reform, a rule that was an administrative action from the Trump administration. They never implemented it. So they're saying that they're saving something that won't be implemented and that was never even in play. People in the private sector who do that, and people in your jobs that do that, go to jail. We haul you before Congress and we browbeat you, and then we send the law enforcement to go arrest you at your home and throw you in jail. Now, I'll get off that. The other schizophrenic policy posturing from this administration that I see is with respect to critical infrastructure, i.e. pipelines. There are other components of critical infrastructure. But you get a Colonial Pipeline hack and it takes away the whole northeastern part of our country's access to gas, and it is a full-blown crisis. And our president says that's critical infrastructure, and Russia don't hack and don't play with and mess with and disrupt our pipeline critical infrastructure. But then he cancels the Keystone pipeline, which is huge in terms of energy independence, huge in terms of keeping the price of energy for our working families down. Makes no sense. We lose out geopolitically. We cede to Russia and China and other great powers that are breathing down our necks and don't have our values. And we also import more oil and gas that is produced by the dirtiest producers in the world. I mean, there is nothing that makes sense of that. Mr. Crabtree, the Keystone pipeline cancellation and the havoc that wreaked on families and working people that had that as their livelihood, that put food on the table. Can you tell us a little bit about just the personal impact. I just described the macroeconomic impact, the security impact, geopolitical impact. How's that impacting you and the folks that you knew who were trying to make an honest living building critical infrastructure for the United States?
Thank you, Congressman. In 2019, a lot of our projects were shut down because of COVID, and there were many of our union members that didn't get to work at all in 2019. So 2020 comes around, and we get a project like the Keystone Pipeline that was going to employ a great deal of our workforce. We get started on it. 3 weeks later, it's canceled. The companies, the majority of their assets are focused on one project. You can't go start on day one and say, we're going to build a project. So when they canceled that pipeline, it not only left me without a job, it left my company looking for work. So we went through 2019 because of COVID, didn't get to work. Now we got the president coming and shutting 2020 down. So yeah, there are 2 years that a lot of my members didn't get to work at all. And when you don't work in my industry, you lose your retirement credits, you lose health insurance, you lose your dignity, you lose your family in some cases.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for being generous to let Mr. Crabtree finish. I know I took more time than I should have, so thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr.
Craig,
Crabtree.
the gentlewoman from Minnesota, for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Steele, for this focus on infrastructure's role in inclusive growth across our country and, of course, in the great state of Minnesota. Thank you so much to our witnesses for your excellent testimony here this afternoon. Minnesota's 2nd Congressional District, it's made up of suburbs, of exurbs, and lots of rural areas. In fact, my role on this committee is really to focus on how do we reduce economic disparity and create growth in rural communities across our country, because I think that is absolutely vital that we don't leave out our rural communities in this discussion. That's why I was very proud to support the bipartisan infrastructure law, which will make transformative investments in highways and roads and bridges and waterways across our nation. In fact, I'm proud to be a member of Congress who represents those Mississippi River and Minnesota River towns in the 2nd District of Minnesota. Just as important, it will provide $65 billion to expand access to broadband across our country. As Michelle shared in the video that we saw earlier today, broadband access is just critical to places like rural Welch, Minnesota, and so many communities like it across America. We know that rural communities are often the last ones to receive high-speed internet. That's why I've introduced legislation on accurate broadband mapping. And because to make sure those dollars are spent effectively and that they go as far as possible in fostering inclusive economic growth, we need to know exactly which areas should be first in line for broadband expansion projects. With that, I want to start with Dr. Lee for my first question. Dr. Lee, what policy choices would you recommend to this committee and this Congress as we continue to prioritize expanding broadband access to currently and underserved rural areas? And do you think that the $65 billion investment included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill is enough?
Whoa. Well, Representative Craig, I thank you for asking me that question because rural is near and dear to my heart. And the state of Minnesota has actually done a lot to actually push some of these rural development models as well as regional development models. What I would say first is obviously the maps are very important. So I would continue that push towards accurate and sufficient maps. I would also say that we really need to look at how we examine infrastructure in rural areas. Right now in the bill, we have a tendency to preference one technology over another. And in my experiences as part of my book to rural communities, take, for example, the tire shop owner in Garrett County, Maryland, who used television white space, a Microsoft Broadband initiative. He was able to get online to just actually do the queries that he needed for his supplies. Or the person in the video where getting on Zoom was hard because probably she's waiting for some provider to come in and to give service. We need to have hybrid approaches, and we need to be able to say that we cannot wholesale infrastructure when it comes to rural, and we have to be creative about that. I would also say one thing where we can bolster some of the investment, because the money is going to run out. It is the largest down payment that we have, but it's not guaranteed to cover all of America. We actually need double that to do that. With regards to how we can extend this, we need more interagency support. There are programs right now, social services programs held at HHS, educational programs that actually can come to the table and help us not to just bolster access, but to bolster decision-making and problem solving. How do we get those agencies support, Congressman, to be able to put on top of the money that we have better treatment programs, better workforce development programs that rely upon broadband as a conduit? So I hope that helps, but I think we're getting close, but we actually need to be much more creative to extend the shelf life of that money.
Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Lee. I know that accessibility and affordability are very different issues. I'm going to skip my follow-up question to you because I've become known in this select committee for a lightning round, and that involves all of you. So before my time expires, I'd like to do a quick lightning round. In one sentence, what should this committee and Congress be monitoring most closely during the implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law to make sure that an impact in reducing economic disparity in America actually occurs? I'm going to start with Mr. Wade.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Very simple, 5 words: inclusive, impact, and minority business participation.
Thank you. Dr. Martine.
Monitor what states fund and don't fund.
Thank you. Commissioner Higgins.
Get funds flowing to local governments quickly and cut the red tape if you can.
Mr. Crabtree.
Do something to get rid of this, well, not necessarily get rid of it, but the overwhelming permitting process when it comes to construction projects.
And Dr. Lee.
Data. I'll leave it there. We need data.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields at the request of the minority. I will recognize Mr. Donald's out of order for 5 minutes of questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. There was and I didn't know we were going back to being super formal. So like there was a stat that was brought out by our colleague, Ms. Jayapal, about the discrepancy or the disparity in recovery between, frankly, black people and white people. And it was like black people lost like, I don't know what the number was, like $25,000 in net worth, and white people gained $125,000 in net worth. And like, I was more puzzled by the stat because it sounded very arbitrary. If you've examined any flooding situation, if you lose your home, you lose your home. I don't know how that works. I wish we had some time to unpack that, but alas, congressional hearings, they are what they are. Look, I'm gonna get right to it. Obviously, infrastructure is something that there is a public need for it in certain terms. I think the debate is starting to shift from necessary public infrastructure with Dr. Martin and the chart associated with your testimony is pretty accurate. Most of it should go towards roads, highways, transportation, maybe conservation, maybe some technical apparatuses, so on and so forth. But from a federal perspective, now we're coming to that point where is it a public infrastructure project to basically help alleviate broad public good, or now we're starting to get into intimate private aspects of infrastructure to rebalance playing fields in the United States? And that's a very different conversation with respect to infrastructure, something that I think that it's gonna be important for us to think through. I used to serve in the Florida legislature, and so, Ms. Higgins, it's good to see you. We used to serve there, and I remember back when I was there, we were having a major discussion about 5G deployment in the state of Florida. Ms. Higgins, again, it helped me because I remember when we were going through 5G deployment, the state legislature at the time preempted local counties and cities who wanted to have direct oversight about node placement that service providers were doing. I don't know what Miami-Dade County's position was. Do you remember what that position was at the time?
I remember it very well because I think I was the face of how 5G, which is something our country really needs, right, is going to make us much more competitive, but the physical rollout of it, because the decision-making was taken away from the local government that knew the streets so well, what the impact on our streets was literally, we could have an AT&T pole next to a Comcast pole next to somebody else's pole. You literally had sidewalks that were under construction every other day and not repaired. And so it did create a lot of issues when it comes to sort of the neighborhoody issues. On the flip side of that, we do have 5G poles there. We still don't have it throughout most of the county. It was really rolled out in what I would say is the densely populated tourism-based areas, which of course have lots of people and lots of visitors and lots of events. So it's one of those things where I believe that if we would have had a little more say to be able to say, we'd like it if you would put your poles here rather than in front of this historic structure, it probably would have been a better rollout, but we missed that balance between faraway government and local government.
So I guess here's my question on that, because this was obviously a battle between the state of Florida preempting local government. Do any of you really think it's better for the federal government to now take that role away from local government or even state government? And that's a facetious question because I'm kind of out of time. I guess because the real point is that up here, I mean, if you talk to, not just with respect to infrastructure, I'm talking about with respect to healthcare, financial services, whatever the industry is, when communities and service providers have to literally jump through the alphabet soup agencies, it actually creates more dislocation with respect to those decisions being made at the local level to address whatever I will say, the more intimate, individualized infrastructure needs, as opposed to the federal government taking that. Final question, Ms. Higgins, I'm gonna come back to you. What would you say are the biggest barriers right now that exist with respect to permitting projects that exist, I'm just specifically Miami-Dade County, that have federal dollars assigned to it? What do you say were the biggest roadblocks to that?
For us, I think you raise a really good point that sometimes we do need, whether it's the state government, local government, we're in partnership with the state, we're in partnership with our federal governments, and it's okay that you have eyes and, a different set of eyes and a different pair of ears looking at projects. And so I'm not saying that all federal, permitting questions need to go away, but I do think we need to find a way to make them go more quickly. And by the way, with this influx of infrastructure dollars, one of the things that does worry me is, are we staffing up to make sure that approval processes, because the federal government right now is providing some of this, are we staffing up appropriately to make sure that those agencies can help, whether it's state-funded projects or local-funded projects, get out the door more quickly?
Ms. Higgins, I actually share that concern, because from what I've seen around this place, that answer is flat out no. Mr. Chairman, thanks for the indulgence. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Just for clarity, the committee does roundtables in which we encourage all kinds of back and forth pretty informally, which is great. We can also have a colloquy in a formal hearing environment, but to do that, a member will formally need to yield time to another. With that, I recognize Mr. Davidson, the gentleman from Ohio, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman. I think our witnesses, I think it's fitting that we ended on just how many strings are attached to this money, which is one of the big problems. But let me not bypass the fundamental problem. Perhaps the most essential piece of infrastructure our federal government has is our money, our supply of money. We think of everything in dollars currently. And, we used to be constrained by, how much tax revenue we raised. If we were going to spend more money than we had, we'd have to say, well, we have to find a way to pay for it. And then, in the early 2000s, there was this idea that Reagan-proved deficits don't matter. Dick Cheney said that. It was false. And at least, though, you were constrained in that model by how much money somebody would lend you. And really, since the 08-09 financial crisis, America's currency's been backed by nothing, not even the amount of money people will lend us. And so when you think about the Federal Reserve, their balance sheet has grown from less than $1 trillion to $9 trillion. So what is that doing? It's undermining the value of all of our money, and it is massively growing economic disparity. It is massively growing the wealth gap, and it is creating an architecture that pits us against one another. And often the solution is we need more government. Well, the more government costs more money. And unless there's some remedy to put discipline in our monetary system, it grows us further apart. So I think we really need to look at that most basic piece of infrastructure for our economy, the United States dollar, and the way that the fiscal policy that we do grows that gap, not just because we spend the money, but how we're doing it. So we have to have some discipline in it. It's clearly not there right now, and that'll be a big change. We can't go there overnight, but let's think about the biggest piece of infrastructure in the United States goes back to Dwight Eisenhower. You know, the interstate highway system, and at that point in time, the federal government had just funded a massive war in World War II. And Dwight Eisenhower realized he couldn't have guns and butter. We were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, so we had to defend the United States of America, but there was a priority to repay the debt that was accumulated after World War II. In fact, the whole global monetary system had just been restated at the end of World War II. And rather than blow fiscal discipline out and just spend whatever it took to build the interstate highway system, there was some discipline of how are we going to pay for this. The next thing about that project and true infrastructure is, how are we going to pay that? The infrastructure actually generates some sort of return for the American economy. And unfortunately, so much of this most recent infrastructure bill violates those principles. Not only isn't it well paid for, not only is it not covered with taxes or lending, it grows the wealth gap by destroying our money. It has a better effect for China's economy in some areas than America's. Why? Because China dominates electric vehicles, components like batteries, and they dominate the rare earth mineral system. And so when you look at the supply chain crisis, it pushes us to import more from China. Rather to make investments in the United States, it makes it harder to generate the electricity we need while adding more demands on electricity in the United States. So it's problematic. It's great for the Green New Deal, folks. It moves the ball towards that agenda, but that agenda is, if not on purpose, certainly a consequence is it's better for China than it is for America's economy. And you say, well, that's a near-term pain, and in the long run, it's going to work out. But let's think about what it does at the ports. Our country needs to improve its infrastructure if we're going to compete in the international economy. We have too many failing bridges, low-quality roads, crumbling locks and dams, outdated cargo ports, and these have led to an enormous supply chain backlog that's harming every business in this country. California's shipping container backlog has been a visual reminder of our supply chain crisis. The $1.2 trillion infrastructure spending bill passed mostly by Democrats includes $17 billion for port infrastructure. And of that $17 billion, about $2.6 billion is specifically earmarked for defraying the cost of upgrading equipment at America's ports. But this money can only be used for human-operated equipment. It's a gift to the labor unions that operate the ports. Automated ports can unload cargo ships nearly twice as fast as human-operated machines, but this bill prevents investment in equipment that we know would help solve the supply chain crisis. This is just one example, and we've highlighted so many other ones. I would prefer that we make it easier to invest in America, and that's the way that we ease the burden at the ports. But even when we're going to make the investments at the ports, we don't do it in the most efficient way. We do it with political motives. It's a shame that we've seen that happen, and it's a shame that we continually do this to our money supply with the way money is spent here. With that, I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize Ms. Kamek, the gentlewoman from Florida, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Himes and Ranking Member Stile, for hosting this hearing today. Also, thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the committee. And first, before I begin, I would like to thank the chairman for entering into the record the Associated Builders and Contractors letter discussing the president's recent executive order requiring federal construction contracts greater than $35 million to be subjected to project labor agreements and its negative effects. I am very concerned about this harmful move, so thank you to the chairman for including that very important letter into the record. Now, while infrastructure has historically been an area where both parties have found common ground and agreement, that has recently changed. Rather than focusing on areas that matter to our economy and communities across the country, like roads, bridges, ports, broadband access, the term infrastructure has become the Trojan horse for leftist policy objectives like the Green New Deal. As you all know, infrastructure is widely viewed as an area for bipartisan agreement and cooperation. Both sides of the aisle view infrastructure, meaning roads and bridges, ports, broadband, as an essential role of the federal government. The federal government's role in developing and maintaining a national network of highways and bridges is traced back to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution and was strengthened with the enactment of the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956. Since then, it's been an essential for the federal government and state governments to partner and to address the needs that exist throughout our country. Unfortunately, this administration has taken steps that betray this important relationship between federal and state. In a recent memo, the Federal Highway Administration sent an outline policy for distribution of grants and other resources under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This memo, entitled Information, Policy on Using Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to Build a Better America, applies a one-size-fits-all approach that will inhibit a state's ability to make the best decisions for their infrastructure needs by encouraging states not to build new highway capacity. I'll repeat that. They encourage states not to build new highway capacity. Specifically, the memo states, consistent with this policy, we will implement policies and undertake actions to encourage and, where permitted by law, require recipients of federal highway funding to select projects that improve the condition and safety of existing transportation infrastructure within the right-of-way before advancing projects that add new general-purpose travel lanes serving single-occupancy vehicles. While this may be the right solution for Washington, D.C., it certainly does not work for my home state of Florida. According to the latest U.S. Census, Florida grew by 2.7 million people, or 14%, over the last 10 years, more than double the U.S. average growth rate. And according to the Florida Chamber of Commerce, by 2030, it is estimated that there will be more than 150 million daily vehicle miles added to Florida roads. Meanwhile, according to the latest from the American Society of Civil Engineers report card, Florida's daily vehicle miles traveled has increased 84% since 1984, but the highway system lanes have only increased 25%. I think we can all see the disparity and discrepancies we have here. So rather than the top-down approach to infrastructure that the administration is attempting to push, these decisions should be made by those who know what's best at the state and local levels. Florida and other states know their transportation challenges better than anyone and do not need ideology-based or political-based solutions imposed on them by DC bureaucrats. This administration should and must reverse course immediately and leave these decisions where they have always been made, in the hands of our states. Now, Mr. Crabtree, I appreciate you pointing out that most of the energy infrastructure industry does not rely on government funding, but is funded by the private sector. From your extensive firsthand knowledge and experience in infrastructure, can you tell us how the federal government can best support or get out of the way of deployment by the private sector?
Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. Now, can you tell us how the federal government can best support or get out of the way of deployment by the private sector?
I think, in my testimony, especially about this, the permitting problem we have, I could go on and on about the projects that are not being built right now because of just the companies, some of them went bankrupt going through the permitting process. It's outrageous.
Thank you. Now, where you're from in Arkansas, it reminds me a lot of where I'm from in North Florida. And I gotta say, when my constituents have to get from point A to point B in an affordable, well-maintained road, it can be a little challenging at times. Is that something in your part of the country and my part of the country that we have in common?
Oh, exactly.
Okay. Would you think that an infrastructure bill like the one that is touted by this administration should focus on infrastructure that Americans care about, like roads, bridges, highways, rather than Teslas and light rails?
I believe, it would, especially in my industry with the aging of the pipelines and the lack of them, it was one of my first thoughts when the Colonial Pipeline was hacked. Why do we only have one pipeline servicing such a big part of the country? That's not right.
I appreciate your testimony, Mr. Crabtree, and thank you to our witnesses. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I know I'm over my time. I yield.
The gentlelady's time is expired. I think that brings our questioning to a close. I do want to express special thanks to our witnesses for the rough and unpredictable start. I also, as any of the members will tell you, I put an enormous premium on working really hard to identify those ideas which achieve bipartisan support on this committee. And I'm struck that Ms. Higgins and Mr. Crabtree both made passionate arguments for streamlined approval processes. And as a consequence, I'm going to direct the staff to reach out to both of you to offer up some tangible, actionable ideas that the committee might consider. With that, I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 10 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address provided to your offices. With that, I thank the witnesses again, and our hearing is adjourned.